anthropologists tell us that when human societies first emerged, most of them survived by a strategy that is called hunting and gathering. Basically, that means that they lived by finding whatever wild plants they could and gathering them, and killing and eating whatever wild animals they could manage to. But sometime between 7,000 and 5,000 BC, a new strategy for survival began to emerge in the Near East and in North Africa, by which people began to settle down and live in one place, and to plant domesticated crops and raise them, and to raise domesticated animals for their meat. This startlingly new strategy was something called agriculture, and it changed everything. Now, in many ways, the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture was a difficult one. It was traumatic in many ways. And the difficulties of that shift created a memory that was passed down through the generations from father to son in the form of a story. And that story was eventually recorded in a very, very old book called the Bible. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, the Bible tells us, and Cain a tiller of the ground. These two men represent these two parts of the agriculture strategy. Abel represents those who raised domesticated animals, Cain those who were able to raise domesticated crops. And actually, the rival between these two brothers also remembers an ancient rivalry between the herders on the one hand and the farmers on the other. The relationship was not always peaceful. Now, agriculture, this strange new strategy, brought with it many benefits. Because of agriculture, human populations were able to grow and thrive like never before. But the creation of agriculture did not come without risks and problems. And in particular, the very big risk that came with agriculture was this. It was kind of dangerous to eat domesticated animals. You see, back in the days of hunting and gathering, eating meat had been pretty simple and straightforward. First of all, it only happened very rarely. I mean, given their crude weapons and tools, ancient hunters very rarely were able to bring down big game. But when it happened, it was an event. And usually what happened was the animal was left where it had fallen, and the entire tribe or clan or family came together and went out where the prey was. Of course, they had no way of preserving the meat, and so what had to happen was immediately that animal was butchered and cooked and prepared, and everybody sat down and ate it together. And when the feast was over, whatever they hadn't eaten, the bones, the fat, other leftovers, could simply be left where they lay. Scavengers would come and clean up the area, but the people could just move on and didn't need to worry about it. But all of this changed and became very complicated in settled agricultural community, because when you take your domesticated animal and slaughter for a feast in your village, what happens? Once again, the entire community comes together, they eat it all at once because it cannot be preserved. But what happens after the feast? Because if you leave the bones and other leftovers there where you were eating in the middle of the village, what happens? Well, the first thing that happens is this. rather dangerous animals are attracted into your settlement. That's not good. But the second thing that happens is even worse. As insects and bacteria are attracted by the rotting remains of your feast, sickness and pestilence begins to spread throughout your village. Now these, as I said, were very simple, primitive people. And when sickness and pestilence spread in their communities, they came to the simple, primitive conclusion that their gods must be angry with them. And that is why the creation of agriculture was associated with another invention: animal sacrifice. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. There's no accident at all that immediately after the Bible's account of the invention of agriculture, it immediately passes on to an account of the invention of animal sacrifice, because the two went together. Now, we no longer practice animal sacrifice. It's not part of what we do, and so we don't really understand what it was like. And we do not understand how it functioned in ancient societies. We actually think of animal sacrifice as rather a crude and barbaric practice, not to mention a wasteful practice. We think of it as a wasteful practice because we imagine animal sacrifice as a ritual where the entire animal was put on top of an altar, burnt up, turned to ash, wasted from our point of view. But you need to understand that that kind of sacrifice, where the entire animal was burnt on the altar, it did happen in the ancient world. It was called a whole burnt offering, or a holocaust in Greek. But that kind of offering was very, very rare. By far the most common type of offering was the kind of offering we see described in our reading in the book of Genesis, where only a portion of the animal is burnt on the offering. And so as it says in Genesis, when Abel brought his offering, he only put the fat portions of his meat on the altar. In other words, he put on the altar the parts he wasn't going to eat. The rest, it is understood, was cooked and consumed by Abel and his family. See, that's what we don't get about animal sacrifice. The people actually ate the offering, or at least most of it. Only those portions that they weren't going to eat, the bones, the fat, some of the internal organs, were placed upon the altar. This is how a sacrifice would have worked in the ancient world. Say you had an animal that you'd been raising on your little farm for a year, a young calf. When you decided you wanted to slaughter the calf, you would take it, and you and all your family would go to the altar of the god. And when you arrived at the altar, you would give your calf to the priest. Now, who was the priest? He was a man. Yes, it was always a man. He was a man who had been trained all his life in the art of slaughtering and butchering animals. So the priest would take your animal, slaughter it for you, butcher it up, and then you would give to the priest a portion of the animal as payment for his services. But the rest of the good meat you would take, and you and your family would build a little fire over here, you would cook it up, and you would eat it together. And as you ate there by the altar, the priest would take the parts of the animal you weren't going to eat, the bones, the fat, some of the internal organs, and burn them up and consume them on the altar. That was the god's portion of the meal. And just lucky, I guess, that the gods were happy to receive what the humans didn't want to eat. But that's how it worked. And an amazing thing happened for these primitive people. They discovered something. For when the sacrifice was skipped, and the leftover of their feast was left in the middle of the village to rot, bad things happened. People got sick and died. Clearly, the gods were angry for having been refused their part in the feast. But when the sacrifice was observed, and the portions they weren't going to eat were burnt on the altar, guess what? Nobody got sick. Nobody died. People got strong and healthy because of the extra protein in their diet. Clearly, the gods were pleased. And so, it was obvious to them. The gods loved sacrifices of their animals. And that's what we see going on in our reading this morning from Genesis. When Cain comes and gives his offering of grain and plants from the ground, there is no response from God. No indication of God's pleasure. This kind of offering doesn't matter. But when Abel comes and brings the fat portions of his sheep, the results are clear. God is clearly pleased. And so that is why the practice of animal sacrifice, almost non-existent before, became essential as soon as people settled down and began to develop agricultural communities. And this practice, this way of dealing with meat, spread throughout all the ancient world, all to the ancient Near East, all over the Mediterranean basin. And when you understand how this system functioned in their society, they don't really look quite so much like the barbarians and savages that we once imagined. I mean, if you look at it from one angle, the sacrificial system was basically an ancient food safety system, a way of dealing with the dangers of occasionally eating meat in a safe and respectful manner. And in many ways, I look at how they handled those problems, and it seems to me that some of them they handled better than we do today. Because, of course, we also have our ways of dealing with the dangers of eating meat in modern society. And you know what? Our systems don't always work. Our ways of dealing with the leftovers from meat production have not always worked. Remember a little problem called mad cow disease that came up a few years ago? We didn't handle that too well. Now, because we as modern people eat a whole lot more meat than ancient people did, we actually slaughter many more animals than they ever did. But here's the thing, when we do it out of sight, out of mind. We actually kind of like to pretend that it doesn't happen at all. In our minds, we like to pretend, I think, that all those pieces of meat just sort of materialize out of nowhere on those nice little styrofoam containers in the grocery store. We don't like to think about where they come from. But ancient people didn't have that option. They knew, and knew very well, where their meat came from. They were there. They stood in the splash zone as their food was prepared. They knew what it meant to eat meat. They knew that something living had died so that they could eat and live and be strong and healthy. And for them, that meant that the eating of meat was in fact a profoundly spiritual activity. It was holy, it was sacred. Something had died so that they could live. And for them it was entirely fitting that they should share such a holy meal with their gods. It just made sense to them. And so the gods were given their portion and ate alongside the worshipers. That's how they thought of it. Now, when the people of Israel came along, and they came to know a different God, a God who in time they came to see as the one and only God, the creator of all, the Father of all, the one God who proved that all other gods were merely idols. As they came to know this strange God, the Israelites merely assumed that this God of theirs desired sacrifice. Just like all the other gods of all the other peoples around them. They took it for granted. Now, did God really want all those pieces of meat, all those leftovers of their slaughter? I don't think so. I don't think God really cared for those things. And in fact, God said as much in our song reading this morning. God says to the people, if I were hungry, I would not tell you. For the world and all that it is in it is mine. Do I eat the flesh of buds? Do I drink the blood of goats? The answer clearly is no. God didn't want the meat. God didn't care about that. But I suspect that God did understand that all of these sacred rituals around eating meat did function for them as a kind of food safety system. And so God was only too happy to participate in that system with them to their benefit. So God shared those sacrificial meals with them. And as that happened, as the people of Israel shared in sacrificial meals together with their God, something happened in that relationship. They came to know their God. They came to love their God in and through this ritual of sacrifice. Their God came to know them. Just as any time you sit down and share a meal with strangers, you leave the table better acquainted, more like friends. And so it was that sacrifice, the sacrifice of animals, became the primary way in which the ancient people of Israel thought about and learned about their relationship with their God. And that is how things continued, right up until the year 70 AD, when the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. And all of a sudden, the entire sacrificial system for the Jews came to a sudden end. And all of a sudden, the Jews had to develop an entirely different system for eating meat and being safe. A system that still persists to this day called the kosher system. But that means that all of the first Christians, the Jews, the early Gentile converts, lived in a world where animal sacrifice was the norm, where it took place all the time. In a city like Ephesus, for example, all of the meat that was available for consumption to anyone had been killed in the temple of one god or another. It was everywhere. And that makes it kind of interesting that the first Christians, very early on, came to understand what had happened to Jesus, came to understand his death on the cross as a sacrifice. And so, for example, we have in the letter to the Ephesians, Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. I mean, you realize that the person who wrote that was entirely familiar with a fragrant offering, knew exactly what one smelled like. And the people who first received that letter and opened it and read it, they knew what that smelled like too. Why, they could probably smell the fragrance from the latest offering from the temple just up the street. As they read this, they knew what it was about. They were entirely familiar with it. But the problem is that we're not familiar with it. We don't know what it smells like. It's all foreign to us. So I think we sometimes struggle to understand what that means to call the death of Jesus a sacrifice. Often when we talk about it, we tend to think of it as a kind of substitution. We speak of the death of Jesus in some sense as Jesus taking our place, suffering a death that was due to us. And I know you can get that idea of Jesus' death as a substitution from a few places in the New Testament. But really that idea of substitution has nothing to do with the idea of sacrifice. There was no sense in which an ancient sacrifice was seen by anyone as a substitution. When you took your animal to the altar, there was no sense in which you saw that animal somehow taking your place on the altar. The animal certainly didn't see it that way either. Sacrifice wasn't about substitution for them. Basically, it was just part of life. It was something that had to happen, kind of tragic for the animal, of course, but it had to happen. It was part of life. It was part of living. Something had to die so you could live. It was sacred. It was a chance to come together with your family. It was a chance to get to know your God. That's how sacrifice functions. And that's how I kind of like to think of the death of Jesus. Not as a substitution, but as this bad thing. I mean, this really bad thing that happened. Jesus died. It was tragic. It's the kind of thing that happens all the time in this world when somebody stands up and challenges the way things are and challenges the powers that be. Jesus suffered the consequences for that. But somehow Jesus managed to transform the meaning of his death. He transformed it, of course, by his resurrection, and we'll get there on Easter. But he also transformed it by this understanding of it as a sacrifice. What that meant for the early Christians was that because of Jesus and his death, they could be brought together with one another. That because of Jesus' death, as it says in Ephesians, we could put away all bitterness and wrath and anger and wrangling and slander, together with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. Because of the death of Jesus, we can come together, really be a community together. But that's not all. Even more important, the death of Jesus brings us closer to our God, ties us in to our Father in heaven. Will you take a few moments in silence? We do praise and thank you, Lord Jesus, that your death, as horrible, as tragic as it was, opened up a new possibility. Brought us to our God in a way not possible before. Let us draw near to you and see your death as that fragrant offering that transforms our community and transforms our relationship with God. Amen.